to AT&T ThreatTraq for April 23rd, 2013. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. I'm joined today with John Markley, Jim Clausing, and John Hogaboom. I'm Brian Rexroad. And let's go ahead and pass it over to John Hogaboom. I guess, John, you've traditionally done some reports in the past on malware spam, that is, spam emails that have malware attachments associated with them. I thought this was an interesting study that came up. What can you tell us about it?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So there is a study that came out from a German security group. I have the link here to avtest.org, and they're an independent IT security group. And what they did is they did a study kind of like I was doing on a week-by-week basis, but they did a much more prolonged study over an 18-month period and to analyze spam. So it was conducted over an 18-month time frame. They had about 90 spam probe accounts, and in total they analyzed 550,000 spams. So I was kind of thinking in my head about this compared to how we do things, and some of the things, on a weekly basis, I would be analyzing easily 500,000 spams, but 200,000 of those might be the same ones repeated. So I have a feeling that this might be unique spams. They didn't actually say that, but I think that's what they're implying here. Mm-hmm. And when you look at all 550,000 of these, about 2.5% in total led to an infection. And I think that's about kind of what we used to see when I had done those studies back then. We might have been down more around a 1%-ish or 1.5%, but it's pretty close. So of the 550,000, about 14,000 led to an infection. When you actually break it down like we used to as well, looking at the ones with attachments, 30,000 of the emails had attachments, but only, 30% of those, I shouldn't say only, 30% of the emails with attachments actually were malicious. So about 10,000 of those emails. And then of the 550,000 spams, 400,000 of them had links inside. And only 1% of those links were malicious. And that's kind of what you would expect. Most of them are going to be something else. And so that's 1% were malicious, which is about a total of about 4,000 or so. And that gets you to that number, about 14,000 total malicious emails out of the 550,000 sampling pool. Some other interesting things that they mentioned here, and this is kind of, I think they're playing with numbers a little bit in my opinion, but they did notice that in terms of the amount of spam sent on a daily basis, Monday through Friday, it kind of had a certain, they had a certain number of hosts sending the spam. But then on Saturday and Sunday, that number decreased quite a bit. I think on Saturday it's around 79% and about 72% maybe on Sunday. So their theory there is that, well, these must be machines, these missing machines must be ones that are located in offices or they've been shut down for the weekend. Possibly. It's, I think it's a possible explanation for that. There are other types of machines that might get shut off over the weekend as well. But that's kind of their theory to that. And truth be told, I think we've seen some of this in some of our other analyses in general, that there are a lot of infections inside corporations and whatnot.
Yeah, John, I was just going to say, I think we've seen some similar kinds of characteristics where there certainly is a much stronger weekend downtime associated with office activity. So I think that's a reasonable, assumption that they're making there.
Right.
Yeah, but there are weekends when I don't fire my laptop up, at home. I'll fire it up in the evenings, but some weekends I just get busy doing other things. So.
Right. A couple other slides that they had. So they did a breakdown of country, and I'm not quite sure how they determined what country sent each of the spams, because if they believe the headers, I'm not sure that that's an accurate measure, although, maybe that's how they based it. I'm not quite sure. They didn't go into that detail in their report. However, what you do notice is of all the ones, so for the U.S. here, the majority of the spam emails that they had in their sampling pool came from the United States, which is this blue column here, but only a small percentage of those, about 10% or so, were actually malicious. So, it's other types of benign spam that accounted for that. One interesting observation is that India and Vietnam both have malware to spam ratios of about 78% and 77%. So of all the spams that came from India, 78% of them were malicious, and Vietnam, 77% was. So you have a very high likelihood that if you get a spam from one of those two countries, that it probably will contain malware, whereas some of these other countries maybe not so much.
So these are the sources of the malware or the spam messages? Or
That's
the recipients? Correct. Okay,
yep.
Sources.
The source of the spam email, right. And then the top 10 infected email attachments. This was something I would also cover pretty frequently in the report that I would go over. And but I never went into quite as much detail about it. But you can see here, and this is a little bit hard to view, but these file attachment types in emails, SCR, EXE, PIF, COM, BAT, they're all pretty much 100% or very close to 100%. If you had an attachment with that extension in the email, it was malicious. Mm-hmm. For zip files, about 90-something% of them, of the zip files in attachments, in spams, were malicious, and then it kind of goes down from there. And I think we've observed that as well. Those are the types of file formats that you would want to be careful about in terms of opening and or executing on your machine. And that's generally a report. I would recommend, we do have the link here up at the top here for the full report. I would recommend checking it out. It came out this month. It goes into a lot more detail. Mm-hmm. And with some of their methodology and some other things about how to test if your machine might be infected. They have some methodologies in there and some websites you can visit. I didn't check them out myself, but they have some means to maybe check to see whether your machine might be a spam bot in a known spam bot network.
All right, thanks, John. And that was from the AV Test. I guess it's avtest.org, which is an independent IT security test organization. I guess they do some research, and as you pointed out earlier, this is a organization that's based in Germany. And I was kind of interested in, it sounds like you had a very good correlation between the things that you've seen previously and, perhaps being from Germany or from the U.S., it doesn't really make a significant difference in terms of the profile of activity. Is that your observation as well?
That's my observation. It seems like spam is pretty much a universal problem or a worldwide problem. It doesn't seem to necessarily have many boundaries in terms of countries who's getting it. So I would imagine their spam probe accounts are probably in Germany, whereas ours are primarily U.S.-based, and we seem to be seeing similar types of statistics here. Mm-hmm. So maybe if you're in another country, some of these other ones like India, you might actually see more, or Vietnam, perhaps based on some of the information they had there. But I'm not quite sure. I guess that would depend on your spam probe accounts and how they're set up.
It would be kind of interesting. I was going to say, it'd be kind of interesting if you could break it down by English versus non-English. Do you see more spam with non-English emails, or are malicious with more non-English? I don't know how you would perform that study, but that would be kind of an interesting corollary.
Yeah, it is a good point. In our analyses, it's almost always been English. Although I have done some analysis and gotten some spams in other languages, particularly Arabic, and we had some malicious ones of that format or in that language, but most often it's English. But you're right, it would be interesting to see, even just in general, how much spam and what languages they break into. Not with respect to whether it's malicious or not. It might just be interesting spam in general to find out what the breakdown is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because some of the mailing lists that I'm on, where we purposely don't filter the spam, collect more of it, get a lot of it in various other languages, a lot of Eastern European, Russian and Ukrainian, get a lot of those, but don't know what that really means. But I see a lot of spam in other languages too.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I guess the one other sort of observation, and I'm not sure this would be anything that you could measure statistically at all, because there isn't really any sufficient statistical sampling, but at least in the cases that I am aware of where attacks, and these were for the most part associated with bank fraud type activity, where they were actually targeting not just the home computer, but also, or computer in general, I guess, but also targeting a mobile device to try to get around the, sort of the two-factor authentication or the back-channel authentication tools. The cases that I'm aware of were associated with Germany. So I'm not sure if, like I said, I'm not sure if there's any significance to that from a statistical point of view, but it was at least an observation. There have been multiple cases, not a huge number, but multiple cases where that's been the situation.
Right.
In any case, thank you very much for bringing that to us, John. And let's go ahead and pass it over to Jim Clausing here. And I guess, Jim, we've probably talked about this maybe too many times, but yet again, I guess maybe a little different slant on this. What is the weakest point?
The human being is the weakest link in the chain, and it kind of follows directly from what John was just talking about. This was an article that was brought to our attention by in Dark Reading. I guess it was last week, or maybe the week before. About the endpoint, the human being being the weakest link and the attacker's best bet for getting in. And one of the, we've talked about the various times bad guys leaving flash drives in the parking lot or and folks taking them in, plugging them into their computers, phishing attacks. And it's a hard problem. We try to train our users not to open attachments. We say it on this show pretty much every week to be careful and not open attachments from people you're not expecting them from, or even people that you know if didn't know they were coming. But the bad guys, continue to try to exploit that. And a couple weeks ago we were talking about how they use social networking sites to try to gather more information to create phishing attacks that you're more likely to fall for because they look like they're from people you know or about topics that they know you're interested in, specifically targeting individuals.
Right. So, and then, clearly this is a sort of a fact of life that as we've gotten into the social networking activities and more people have an opportunity to know more things about you, it certainly provides a lot more opportunities for these types of attacks that are specifically, targeted to individuals.
Yeah, well, and one of the charts that they put in the article that they got from Trend Micro was, was similar. You're looking at the attachments in the targeted emails. First of all, they say targeted spear phishing attacks. About 94% of them have, according to some Trend Micro study on this, have attachments, and only 6% of them have, links of other sorts, but not attachments. And of those attachments, it was surprising though that in the previous survey, they were saying that nearly 100% of the .exes, .scrs, whatever, are malicious. But in this particular study, they're showing that about 38% of the attachments are RTF files, and 15% are Excel spreadsheets, which aren't necessarily the ones that are always malicious. But if the bad guys have found a particular vulnerability in one of the in the Office suite, for example, and target 0 days there, that's one way of exploiting it, or having macros in there that just do things that the wasn't aware they were going to do.
Mm-hmm. Now, was this study focused toward a particular kind of audience, maybe perhaps based on enterprise emails opposed to just a general consumer email? That I guess I'm trying to understand perhaps what one of the things that might have distinguished what John just was talking about versus what you've observed here.
Yeah, well, I think the Trend Micro study, and I haven't actually read that report, but there were a couple of graphs in this dark reading article from there. And I believe that one was actually looking at APT-type attacks that were launched via spear phishing. So those would be, targeting corporate types as opposed
to... And there is a big difference there, because we're talking about a big pool of spam.
Right.
And there's a lot of that gets repeated. It gets sent to a lot of different people. APT and spearfish emails is a very small amount. It's only going to a very few select number of people in each company. It's very targeted, very specific. Like you said, they're using social networks like LinkedIn and whatnot to go figure out who they want to send it to. So it's a much smaller selection pool. I don't even consider spearfishes to be spam, in my opinion. It's like a very targeted, attack. And one of the things I have observed as well is they do use other file format types. Other than, we have seen some EXE, but very rare. Like you said, Excel is a big one. We've seen some PDFs and RTF. So, and especially with Excel, these guys who are generating or creating these spearfishes, they have like some very highly 0-day that they've developed exploits for those particular Microsoft Office programs that nobody else knows about. Even Microsoft isn't even aware of how to fix it yet, or even aware that it's out there. So, it's one of those, it's interesting, and people aren't on guard as much about, especially Excel, but they've been using that for at least the past 2-3 years in these spearfish attacks.
Yeah, well, and one of the things that they talk about in this article is, the debate about user education and how useful that is. I mean, we are always telling people, as I said earlier, not to open attachments and that kind of stuff. But, how effective is that? And you can go to one extreme and overdo it to the point where people stop listening, or or you don't do it enough so that people pay attention to it. And I don't know where that balance is, but some enterprises have done a really good job of getting their users to at least report suspicious emails and suspicious attachments. And I think that's probably the best that we can hope for, is that we can train our users to be suspicious enough that, even if they accidentally open one, then they start thinking, well, that was a little odd, and maybe I should report that to the security guys and have them check it out.
I think some of the most successful security stories that exist today are actually kind of have a foundation in the notion of crowdsourcing. That is, having lots of people that are, in many senses, potential victims, with an opportunity or capability to report in their observations about things that appear to be suspicious or they have a question about, and pooling those so that the real issues can start to be brought to the surface. I think that's where that's been successful in the mobile app stores, where users are reporting back the things they find dissatisfactory about tools. It's been successful. One traditional activity was and I think still exists, is the fish tank activities, where potential phishing sites are reported back. Antivirus companies are using that significantly for the end client applications that sort of automate the reporting of what's been detected and how prevalent those things are, to help define how much risk are associated with those events that are detected. So a lot of these things are very important, and similarly with reporting spam emails, if you can get the entire organization to be a part of it, it's a heck of a lot additional brain power and capability that are brought to the table. So let's take a little bit of a look at the internet weather over the last week or so here. And the first thing that we're going to take a look at is scan probes on port 6670 TCP. This is actually registered to an application called Voltec Global Online Directory, which I'm not particularly familiar with that, but I did a little bit of research on Voltec, and that actually happens to be the company that's associated with Voice over IP application Magic Jack. Although it turns out that I don't think that's particularly significant to this particular analysis. So in any case, what we saw was this scanning activity on port 6670 TCP, and it turned out there were basically two primary sources that are doing this scanning activity, and both of them associated in China, though they appear to be coming from different service providers there. And doing a little additional investigation, I found that these same addresses were also scanning a number of other ports, and in fact started their scanning activity, and it looks like they've even perhaps stopped that scanning activity at the same time. These other ports included port 80, 6666, 6667, 6668, 6671, 72, that is 6672, 6673, 6674, 6675, as well as port 8080. And so that series of ports is actually fairly well known to be associated with IRC servers, that is Internet Relay Chat. So my suspicion here is that these scanning probes were actually looking for IRC servers, perhaps web servers as well, since they were scanning on port 80 and 8080, and probably not specifically looking for the registered application on this port 6670. So in any case here, that appears to be a situation. There was scanning activity. It basically started around April 20th, seemed to continue just to the end of April 22nd here, so basically across the course of 3 days. And it seems to have gotten back down to normal levels. So you can see that basically in a aggregate view with this graph here. Next item, not any significant activity associated with this, but ones that certainly showed up on the radar. This is scan probes on port 1080 TCP, and this is a port that's typically associated with SOCKS. That's basically a generic application proxy functionality. And most of these probes were from a single source at a hosting provider in France. I think we'd reported on similar activity from a similar sort of source in the past several weeks ago. And there were a few others participating from China, Germany, and a couple of other places as well. But the more significant spikes appeared to be associated with this source in France. And, it's basically short spikes of activity. The motivation for looking for SOCKS servers is so that oftentimes it can be used to anonymize activities, that is, use them as hot points for doing other activities. So I wouldn't say that this is necessarily malicious in itself, but there's a reasonably good chance that the actors that are looking for these SOCKS servers have an intent to use them for perhaps malicious purposes and hiding their origination point. Next item here was scan sources on port 53 UDP DNS. We've been reporting on this for some time now, and it continues to be essentially the same as what we had seen previously, perhaps to a little lesser extent. So you can see there's a clear mode of periodicity that is basically every several days or so here. There's a surge in scanning activity, and then it dies off for a few days and then starts again. And what we are seeing is that, over the period of perhaps the middle of March here, we saw sort of a surge or an increase in activity overall. We've been reporting on that. and it seems to have died down, to sort of not quite to earlier levels, dating back to January timeframe, but certainly down lower than we had previously seen. So, typically I've expected that this scanning activity is looking for open resolvers. There certainly has been a significant growth in DNS amplification attack activity, and open DNS resolvers are used in that to basically reflect attacks against targets using spoof source addresses. And basically my assumption here is that that is the purpose of this activity. Looking at the 10 most probed ports, there aren't any real surprises here. Typically, we expect to see port 445 on here. Port 1433 is on here. 3389 is on here. Port 8080 TCP, we typically don't see that, but that is a alternative web port that's commonly used, and so it's no surprise that attackers might be probing for that. We see port 22 TCP, that's SSH, port 23 TCP, Telnet, and we also see port 6666 TCP showing up as number 10 on the list, and we had already talked about that. We saw some rather described as moderately aggressive scanning activity on that series of ports, perhaps looking for IRC servers. And I thought it would be interesting to share with you here today something that it showed, every once in a while, what I call the probe aggression factor. So what this is looking at is the ratio of the number of sources that are performing probes versus the number of probes that we see. And the intent here is to get an idea of how quickly any one source is actually probing. And there are some little subtle characteristics that you can find in this. So, for example, in a typical, what I describe as, TCP scanning activity, you typically see an aggression factor of about 4, whereas when the attackers are using a tool that's specifically intended for scanning purposes, you can see a higher aggression factor of closer approaching 6 or so. And it turns out, using this example, port 6666 TCP, they are using a fixed source port. So basically what they've done is they've created an application that is specifically sending out the SYN probes on this port, and having perhaps a separate application that's actually on the receiving side to pick up those. And that way they can probe much more quickly and not be too concerned about actually, being bogged down in the operating system with the limit in the number of connections they could be holding up and waiting for responses. So we see some cases here where the more deliberate scanning for activity, this is a stronger indication that there's perhaps some malicious intent behind that, as opposed to some of these others where they still may be a malicious intent, but they haven't necessarily customized the application for doing it more aggressively. Next item here is the most sources probing. This is the number of sources that we're counting, the number of IP addresses that are doing the probing on a particular port. As usual, port 445 TCP is at the top of the list. There aren't any other significant surprises here. We see port 23 TCP on the list. There are some ICMP ports that are typically not associated with any malicious activity. And then, as we had been reporting, we have several ports, 16, 464, 16, 471, 16, 470, and 16, 465 that are associated with the peer-to-peer communications of the zero-access botnet, which is still running strong. Has softened up just a little bit, but still in healthy state in botnet terms. And last year, I'd like to share with you the reconnaissance index. No significant developments over the last few weeks, other than the fact that we have been showing the last 5 months or so of activity, that there is a sort of a gradual decrease in the reconnaissance index. And basically what that's indicating is that there is a lesser amount of network probing activity that's being detected, and which generally speaking is a good trend. So with that, I guess, John, I'm going to bring it back to you, John Markley, to see if you have any top concerns that you'd like to share with us this week.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, I think the concern, it was kind of interesting that just came to mind just recently. I was at a high school baseball game. My son plays baseball, and we were sitting in the stands watching the game, having a good time, and the girls' soccer team had just finished at the next door field, and they came over and we're watching the game. And to make the long story short, they started, of course, getting on their mobile devices. Every kid has to have a cellular device nowadays. And they were trying to get some websites or do some other work, and then they were getting real slow connection. And they asked one of the parents, "Hey, I see a hotspot that's open. Can I use it?" And the parent said, "Yeah, sure. Here, go ahead and use it. It's mine. Here's the password." Very loudly, very vocally, mentioning that. And basically, all these girls jumped onto this mobile hotspot. And I'm sitting there in the stands thinking, that's could conceptually be a whole lot of data that just got dumped down this person's this phone. And I'm thinking, if I was sitting in the stands and maybe didn't like the person so much, or just kind of wanted to play a prank on them, I might just suddenly just start streaming some movies. I heard the password, I heard everything. And I think it lends itself to the thought that we always talk about is, you keep your passwords safe. You don't publicly declare them. You don't write them on the board. You don't. I had no problem, of course, with the kids using the Wi-Fi hotspot. It was more of the fact that the parent publicly gave it, and that they had no control. She had no. And I got to thinking too is that this parent now all these girls, because of course the devices save that information. Mm-hmm. So every time that this parent turns that hotspot on, it's always on for them. Anywhere near in the vicinity that I can go jump on that hotspot, and there could be a tremendous amount of data that could get lost. So it's, I think the lesson learned, and I kind of mentioned it to the person. I said, you may want to just not share it quite so publicly in the future.
Well, that's probably good advice there, John. I was at a friend's place just a couple of weeks ago, and it was kind of a similar thing. Sort of the opposite scenario. This was a case where, kids had come over, they brought their portable game players, and one of, his son asked, "Dad, what's the password for the Wi-Fi? We want to play games." And I could see the pain in his dad's face as he was saying, "Well, why do I have to give you that information?" Because he wasn't really, too keen on the idea of sharing in this particular case, it was his home Wi-Fi password with that group. So that's one of the challenges. I guess some of the newer home routing devices at least provide the opportunity to have a separate guest account so that you can allow folks in, and you always have the option of changing the password after using that, setting up that personal hotspot and using a different password the next time. So there are certainly some concerns here. In fact, you didn't even mention it, John, but by announcing that out, it also provided the opportunity for folks to effectively sniff what was going on there. So if there were any other transactions, perhaps email accounts were being accessed in the background without even really paying attention to it. So
good point.
That was a good point that you brought up here. Thanks for sharing that. And myself, I don't have any concerns this week. Well, to be more accurate, I don't have any new concerns to share with you. I guess, we've shared a number of them. We've talked already about the issue around passwords, and my biggest concern that seems to keep following me around here is this notion of default passwords on particularly embedded software devices that just don't seem to have a good method for getting into a secure state without having to pay a lot of attention to it. So with that, that's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can contact us through email. Our email address is threattrack@list.att.com. You can contact us through Twitter as well @ThreatTraq. And ThreatTraq is also available in video form. It's available on the AT&T Tech channel at att.com/ThreatTraq. It's also available on YouTube, and you can subscribe to an audio-only feed on iTunes. Thanks for joining us today, John, and Jim. We'll be back next week with a new episode, and until then, keep your network safe.